Hey everyone, welcome to Infinite Patterns, a kaleidoscope podcast brought to you by Borealis Philanthropies, Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. I'm your host, Ty, and with me today is Damaso Reyes from the New Amsterdam News. So today we're going to be talking about reparative narratives and how they shape our identity, how they shape our community, how they shape our culture. So I'll go ahead and give this to Damaso to take it away.
Um, Thank you for having me. I'm Damaso Reyes. I'm the executive and investigative editor at the New York Amsterdam News, one of the country's oldest Black publications. We're 114 years old. And for me, I think a lot of the work that we do in the Black press is about restorative justice. So that topic really resonated with me because our history is about trying to repair the damage of institutionalized racism in America and holding America to accountable to its dreams and its mythology.
When we are actually just kind of moving through what this means for reparative journalism, kind of talk to us about what that looks like at the New York Amsterdam News.
I think it's really about looking at societal harm and also looking at the role that journalism plays, and sometimes also looking at the role that the Black press has played and
Mm,
our own publication has played in creating societal harm, and seeing ways in which we can mitigate that and take an active role in repairing the harm that's been created either by ourselves or by our peers in the media.
mhm. And so when we talk about like doing some like reparative journalism, kind of just for those of us, let's say that this is our first time ever hearing anything about this, or we're new to the subject of reparative journalism, healing narratives for social justice, kind of expound on that for us if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that journalism often does very poorly is looking backwards and looking at history and connecting history to the present. So I think when we look at reparative or restorative journalism, it's about looking at the past and how the past influences the present. So if we think about our coverage of public safety, for example,
Hmm.
oftentimes we are very focused on acts of violence, and we're less focused on the mechanisms that create the environment for those acts of violence to happen, and examining and interrogating the institutional problems that create an environment that allow for violence to happen within our community. So, for example, at the Amsterdam News, we have created a new reporting initiative around gun violence called Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, which is looking at three things: the root causes of, the impact on, and solutions to gun violence in Black and Brown communities. Because we believe that gun violence is not endemic to our community, but it's actually a public health crisis that needs to be solved. So if we think about gun violence within the context of a public health crisis, then we need to look at what's causing this crisis, right? What is the impact on the crisis on our community beyond specific acts of violence? And perhaps most importantly, how can we solve this issue? Right. So it's moving from a situation where ourselves and our peers in the media have often reported, okay, 4 people got shot this weekend.
Hmm.
Okay, that's news, but it's not the only thing that we can or should be reporting on. How did those people come to be shot? How did the alleged perpetrator come to commit this act of violence? What are the societal factors? Let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's go deeper,
Hmm.
because as journalists, I think we have a responsibility to our community to ask harder questions rather than simply be, as I call it, stenographers of sorrow. We have to actually dig deep and challenge this narrative that has developed that somehow violence and gun violence in Black communities that's just what happens. I'll give you an example. In New York City, every Labor Day we have the West Indian Day Parade, this massive parade on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. And when I was growing up, as a young journalist, I would go and photograph and report this parade. there was no gun violence. There was never any violence. And then over the past decade or two, we've seen every year a growing amount of violence and gun violence at this parade. And it's sort of become accepted to the point where last year I was reading a New York Times article about the parade the day after. And, I was reading, and it wasn't until like maybe the towards the end of the article where they mentioned, oh yes, and someone got shot during the parade. So we've so normalized and so accepted this idea that at this event, which celebrates Black culture and West Indian culture, that there will be violence, and it's no longer even a headline. It's no longer even the top of the story. And that to me is someone who grew up going to this parade decades ago during the height of gun violence in New York during the 80s and 90s. There was no violence at this parade, at least not that I remember. It wasn't sort of like, oh, if you go to this parade, you need to watch out. You might, someone might get shot, someone might bring a gun. That wasn't part of our understanding of how this event happened. So there's been a sort of normalization or expectation of gun violence in Black communities. And that's a kind of harm because it then creates a situation where because we expect it, because it's normalized, there's nothing essentially we can do about it. And as a journalist, I reject that. And I think we should all reject that because there's profound harm that happens when we accept such a damaging premise.
No, absolutely. Because, when you think about that, it's almost like a domino effect. Like going back to what you were saying, it's like they were talking about the festival, and then at the bottom, you see where someone got shot. But then also, to think about like the victims of that violence and how it just kind of puts them into a category of, oh, well, somebody got shot. They may be here, they may not be, but we don't take into account that someone was harmed, someone may have died. And it really doesn't give an opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that, this is happening. It kind of just glosses over it, like you were saying. It's like it desensitizes us.
Yeah, and I think the other part of what we historically have done is journalists is that an act of violence happens, and that's where our work as journalists ends. And the reality is the people who have to live with that violence, if they are survivors, or if they pass and their families have to live with that violence and the community have to live with that violence, we don't follow up. And this is a
Mm-hmm.
a tremendous trauma that has occurred within that family, within that community, and almost never do we as journalists actually do reporting on that. And so for us as a news institution, when we were taking a hard look at our approach to covering this, as we call it, a public health crisis, for me, one of the most important things was for us to spend time and energy examining what happens after the shooting, after the act of violence. How does a community heal or not heal? Or, what are the resources that are in place, or what are the lack of resources that impact people's ability to move on and grow and heal after such a terrible act of violence? And that's something that I think in general ourselves and our colleagues haven't done particularly well, and that is a form of harm because we're not telling a complete story. I mean, one of the reasons I became a journalist
Mm-hmm.
was because growing up in central Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s, the few times I would read about my neighborhood, it was reading about violence. And yes, violence did occur in my neighborhood, but that wasn't the only experience that I had in my neighborhood, right? People went to church, people went to school, people went to work, kids played outside. There was a large breadth of experience. But when I
Mm-hmm.
saw my community represented in my local newspapers, I almost exclusively saw that within the context of violence. And so that motivated me to say, hey, look, there's a bigger world that I live in that isn't being shown. And so I want to become a journalist because I want to be able to show and share the breadth of the experience of Black and Brown folks, not just the way outsiders see our community. So I think that,
Mm-hmm.
as a Black journalist working at a legacy Black publication, I think that we also owe it to our community to, on profound issues like public safety, to dig deeper, to do more, to show the holistic view of our community, not just like, okay, some people got shot. and then move on. And then the next weekend, some more people got shot. That gets very, it's hard for us to do in, day out as journalists, but I think it's incredibly hard for our community to read as well. And it's not denying that this violence happens, but that is not the only way to talk about our community. That's not the only way to talk about violence in our community, right? Because there's something that leads to that violence, and then there's something that happens after that violence. And I think that we have to, if we're going to do our job correctly as journalists, I think we need to talk about violence in a 360 way, not just in a very narrow way of, what happened, 5 minutes on a Saturday night in July.
One of the things that you said that really stuck out to me is the healing of the community, but also the healing of the journalists themselves, right? And the trauma that the journalists experience when they're kind of having to report on these issues and things like, things of that nature. Because like you said, it's a 360 approach. And so if you could kind of just talk to us about like, as you were kind of moving through your journalism career, what did that healing look like? How did you have to take, control of that as you continue to report on these issues and also, the process of becoming more 360?
Yeah, I think it takes a certain amount of introspection, um, and it also takes a certain amount of leadership from your editors and your publisher. In our case, our wonderful publisher Eleanor Tatum, to be able to say that this is a problem in our community, and that the way that we have been reporting on it is not sufficient to the scope of the problem. And that's hard to do. And there was some resistance within our newsroom
Hmm.
to change, because in some ways, when you've been doing something for so long, it feels like this is the correct way to do it. No matter whether or not it is the correct way to do it, there's a narrative that develops internally that this is what we've done, so we should continue to do that. So for us, as a news organization, I think we had to take some time and some energy to think about whether or not we were serving our community holistically, and if not, then uh, how do we change that? How do we change that approach? That means that because we're a small newsroom, it means we're going to stop doing some things and start doing some different things, and that is challenging, right? Some people might not like that kind of change, both inside and outside of your news organization. So it takes a certain amount of courage, I think, to be able to say, what we've been doing is not effective. And even though we've been doing it for a long time, it's not as effective. Maybe it's not as effective as we want it to be. Um, so for us, it's about taking a step back and thinking about like the totality of this particular issue, for example, gun violence, and how gun violence doesn't start when somebody pulls a trigger, right? It starts long before that, right? I grew up in a neighborhood that had a lot of violence statistically, and relatively speaking, compared to other parts of New York, still has a lot of violence. I never carried a gun. Most of the people I know never carried guns. What leads someone to carry a gun? What leads someone to carry a firearm? What are the parameters? What's the environment that gets created that says to that person thinks that this is a good idea? We did a story about this last fall about why some young people, specifically young men of color, carry guns in Brooklyn. Right? There are social scientists studying this, and a lot of times it's because they feel like this is the only way they can keep themselves safe, both from potential peers, but also from the police.
Hmm.
And so when you talk to young people about this, right, when you actually hear what they have to say and why they are doing this dangerous thing, then it begins to say, okay, so what is it about our environment that is making this person feel so unsafe that they feel like they need to carry a firearm to protect themselves, even though I might know, or you might feel that that's not going to make them more safe. To them, this is the only way they can feel protected, that they can control their safety. So if that's the case, if this is a motivating factor for a lot of young men, well, then the question becomes, well, what can we do to change that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If 30% of young men in this study say that one of the main reasons, motivators that they have is to protect themselves from the police, then to me, that as a citizen, as a journalist, that says that there is a huge rupture between the people who are supposed to protect these young men and these young men.
Yeah.
So now we need to start digging in and examining why that exists, right? And what we can do to repair that damage that's been done, right? So all of a sudden our focus begins to shift because what have we done? We've engaged with the people who are at risk. We've engaged with the people who are at risk of committing these crimes. Going beyond that, what happens when someone gets shot, right? We have some journalists who are working on some long-term stories about what happens after the trigger gets pulled. How are there resources for people who experience trauma? Are there resources to help them get back to work? Right? These are stories we never hear about because if someone survives, we count that as a win. Wow, this person survived. They did not die. That's a good thing. But if they don't have the supportive services they need to deal with their trauma, both physically and mentally, if they don't have the support services they need to go back to work, that has an impact on the community, which then can perpetuate the kind of violence that we would like to solve, right? But if we as journalists and we as a society are not asking these questions, if we're not following up beyond reporting that, 3 people got shot, 1 person died, 2 people survived, well, okay, what happens after that? What
Yeah.
happens after someone gets out of the hospital? What happens to the person who died, their family? How do they move on? How do they rebuild? Do we as a society, are we providing the things that they need so that their children or their relatives can move on? These are questions that I was never trained to ask as a young journalist. But as a human, I feel like it's really important that we ask these questions
Yeah.
because um, violence doesn't stop once the act of violence is committed, right? If we look at the history of racial violence in our country, we are still experiencing the after effects of chattel slavery in America,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether or not your direct ancestors were enslaved, if you're a black or brown person in this country, you're experiencing the repercussions of that violence, that generational violence. And as a country, that's not something that we want to deal with and talk about directly, right? But we wonder why, or we ask, well, why is there violence in these communities, or why there's poverty in these communities? Well, there's a direct line between these things. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't talk about root causes, we can't effectively talk about solutions, right? Because it's the same thing. Again, we take a perspective that this is a public health crisis, right? If you look at it through a public health lens, then you're you see a symptom, right? The symptom is violence, is gun violence. So if you want to try to ameliorate that symptom, well, what's causing the symptom, right? You don't want to just lance the boil and then send somebody home and then they come back a week later and there's another boil. Well, what's causing the boil? Can we get to that? And we as a society are spectacularly bad, and we as journalists are generally speaking spectacularly bad at getting at root causes and say, hey, this is the reason why this is happening. We're so focused on
Mm-hmm.
the symptom, we're not looking at the cause. Because if we look at the cause, then we can talk about solutions, then we can talk about cures. But if we're just focused on the symptom and quote unquote curing a symptom, well, if you don't deal with the root causes, you're never actually going to cure the symptom. You're going to ameliorate it maybe for a short time. So you might flood the zone with cops. Okay. And then the cops go away. And then the problem comes back. And then you flood the zone with cops. Or maybe the problem moves over 3 blocks, right? You're not solving the thing that's causing the problem. And it's harder. It takes longer. It takes more resources. It's not pretty. It's not as easy as a journalist to do that kind of reporting. But it is necessary if we are going to reject the premise that in this particular
Yes.
case, gun violence is endemic to black and brown communities. As the Amsterdam News, we reject that idea. And so if we reject that idea, then it's okay. So this is something that can be solved. How do we solve it? Well, we can't solve it if we don't know what's causing it. So we have to look at what's causing it. We can't solve it if we don't know the extent of the impact of the problem. So this is why we're taking this three-pronged approach.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that first of all, thank you for that because I there were so many like bing, 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 bings that were going off in my mind while you were speaking. And one of the things in particular was, the fact that we don't get to talk about these things in our community. It's almost like it's a domino effect. It's because we're not able to connect the dots. We don't see these things being spoken about, more so now than ever before. We don't talk about trauma in Black and Brown communities. We don't talk about the things that keep us bound. We don't talk about the root causes for the reasons why we are the way that we are. And because of that, when we don't connect the dots, there is no one else that's going to connect the dots for us. And so we just allow that narrative of this is just what happens in our communities to perpetuate it. It
Absolutely.
just keep going and going and going. And so I really want to, thank you for that and just draw that out because it's like, this is the biggest part of the work. We need to have people see, other communities see us differently. But if we don't start talking about the things that we need to talk about to then highlight for ourselves in our community, we can't expect anybody else to do that for us because they're not.
Absolutely.
Because they're not. What are some of the things that we could do as a community to get involved? What are some of the ways that you guys have now? Like if we want to reach out, if we want to continue these conversations with you in the New York Amsterdam News.
Um, Read our newspaper, visit our website, follow us on social media, send us messages. Let us know what are the things in your community that you think are important that we should be reporting about. Recognizing that we're a very small newsroom, so we can't, sadly, we can't report on every idea
Right.
or every story that gets sent our ways, but we're increasingly doing more and more public forums. So, when those come out, we want folks to show up both virtually and in person. But the truth is we need folks to read and to share our stories. If the work that we're doing, the new type of work we're doing is valuable, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your family members. Share it with your colleagues and your friends on social media. This is really, really important to us. Subscribe, both
Yes.
digitally or, God forbid, in print. Um, because here's the thing: we've been around for 114 years, but there's no guarantee we're going to be around for another 114 or even 14 years or 14 months without the support of our community. And that support manifests itself in a lot of ways, and some of that is economic. If you care about it, right? If you like a restaurant, you patronize it. You go there. You go there once a week, and you order a meal. If you like a source of information, patronize it, support it, share it, subscribe to it if you happen to have the financial means to do so. But here's the thing, we live in an era where there's more information than accessible than there ever has been in the history of humanity, right? So when I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 1980s and 90s, if I wanted to read a newspaper from England, I'd have to get on a train or take a bus for 30 or 40 minutes or an hour, go to a library, ask a librarian, get the piece, get the newspaper with the big pole in the middle of it that was a week or two old.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah. Yeah.
I can access more information than, any human being 50 years ago sitting in my bed. The problem is, and the challenge is, even though we have access to more information than our parents or grandparents could have ever imagined, a lot of that information is not reliable. The vast majority of that information is not created by journalists. Now, that's not to say there isn't valuable and important information that's not created by journalists. That's absolutely not true. However, it's become harder and harder to tell what is reliable, what is fact based, rather than misinformation or disinformation created to fool you. And increasingly, mis and disinformation is being created and targeted to trick and to fool Black people and people of color, to get them to feel divided, to get them to feel powerless. And so places like the Amsterdam News and our peers in the Black press, who for decades have been fighting and supporting the cause of people of color, are still here. We're still doing the work. We're still doing our reporting, but we're operating in a sea of information, right? There's no one needs to come to the Amsterdam News to find information about what's going on.
I just want to just say and just enclose, you know, how you were saying, you know, what are some of the things that we could do as, you know, people who are just, you know, susceptible to whatever social media throws at us. We need those tools. But as we are getting more informed, as we are understanding, you know, there are some things that we need to do on our own to be able to be more equipped to take care of these things. What are some of the things that we could do? Just maybe the last couple of minutes to, you know, kind of like a call to action for those who are hearing this podcast and need to know just, you know, where can I start? I know I have to do something, but where can I start? Outside of going to New York, Amsterdam News, where else can I start?
Well, definitely go to amsterdamnews.com. But here's the most fundamental thing that you can do. Think about how you get your information, right? Just take a step back and think about, on a daily basis, how do you get your information? How do I know about what happened if I didn't see it with my own two eyes, right? Maybe somebody told me about it, right? Had a conversation with my best friend and they told me they saw something that happened on the street. Saw it on the internet, right? How did you see it on the internet or heard about it on the internet? If it's on social media, start looking at what are who are you following on social media, right? Are these, we all follow people we like, we follow our friends, we follow famous people. Do you have any news organizations in your social media feed, right? Do you have any Black journalists in your social media feed? Um, Start thinking about the holistic nature of how you get your information and do a little bit like of a social media audit, right? If you're getting most of your information, right, do you subscribe to any newspapers or any newsletters, any podcasts that are news based, right? Actually do a little bit of an audit and think about, like, the same way you might look in your fridge and be like, oh, I've got, like, 3 cartons of ice cream, but I don't have any tomatoes, right? You might say, okay, I need to go out and buy some tomatoes. I need to eat some salad this week because I've been eating too much junk food. Um, do that same thing for your smartphone, right? Do you subscribe to any newspapers? And here's the most fundamental thing that you can do. Start taking an active approach to engaging with information. So rather than just doing this, right, on your phone, because this is just what's coming at me, right? And I'm stopping, I'm reading maybe, but this is not engaging with information. This is filtering the information that's being thrown at you like a fire hose.
Yes.
Go and seek out information, right? Go to places like amsterdamnews.com, Associated Press, your local newspaper in your town. That's a different thing than just opening up Snapchat or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and seeing what's there, right? So subscribing, or following some news organizations or some journalists on social media, right? That's an active process rather than, well, what does the algorithm give me? Well, again, the algorithm is going to give you ice cream, right? Because we engage with, that was a funny video, or I like that, or that was scandalous, right? We spend more time on that, so the algorithm is just going to give you that. But try to change that relationship, right? Try to change that relationship so that you are like, oh, I heard about this thing. Okay, do a search or go to a news website and do a search and say, hey, I want to find out more about this. Read an article, watch a news segment, listen to a radio report, listen to a news-based podcast on a topic. But again, changing that dynamic from being a passive recipient to being an active recipient. We want you to go out there and seek information and try to find high quality sources of information and try to understand what that means. But be active rather than passive. I think that's if we all just did that, that would really change the landscape in terms of how we engage with information and how we make decisions based on the information that we find rather than the information that gets fed to us.
No, absolutely. Damaso, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much for sharing with us your experiences and sharing with us about what's going on at New York Amsterdam News. Um, we, because I almost, in closing, I just want to say that this last thing is when you do not know or you're not aware of the things that are being put on the inside of you, what's on the inside of you is what comes out. What you believe is literally how you live your life. And when you don't take an active approach to knowing what's real and what's true, then you will literally perpetuate the ideas that the propaganda or the conspiracy theorists or the people who are out there putting fake news so that you can act the way that you want. You will do exactly what they want you to do by not taking ownership and awareness of being informed properly. And so I just wanted to say that because I was like, I wanted to give an amen, but I was like, let me just keep it together. But I really appreciate that because so many of us, especially, you know, younger generation, even older generations, it's like whatever I hear, that's true. Whatever they say on the news, that's just it. And I don't question it. I don't Google it. I don't research it. I don't do those steps. And so now I've lived my life for 25 years thinking one way and one research effort on my own could have changed my life. So I just want to say thank you for that. I want to say thank you for your gems. We truly appreciate having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We are the Infinite Patterns, a kaleidoscope podcast, and today we're here dissecting reparative journalism, healing narratives for social justice. My name is Ty, and I am your host, and we've just received some snap-worthy gems from Damaso Reyes, executive and investigative editor with the New York Amsterdam News, and now we're here with the Gabe Schneider, co-executive director from The Objective. Welcome, 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 Gabe. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
So we're going to move right into our discussion. But before we jump right in, Gabe, I want to first take this opportunity to have you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and your work, and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah. So I got into journalism kind of, well, maybe not in a strange way, but I got into journalism not because I enjoy writing, not because, and I do enjoy writing, but not because I enjoy writing, but because I was pretty upset with the way that I saw journalism being done. And for me, I ended up learning a lot from folks around me. I didn't go to journalism school, and I mostly learned journalism just by watching folks and by watching the folks in my student newsroom in college. And what I saw back then is, you know, journalism that was being done wasn't really being representative of the campus, wasn't really being representative of the public university, which had, a pretty diverse population. But a pretty small black population of students, a large international community, and the newspapers that were on campus weren't doing coverage of those folks. And so that's sort of how I got into journalism. um, since then, I've definitely bounced around a bit. I've been a Washington correspondent. I've been a managing editor. I've been an assistant managing editor. I've been an editorial director. But the objective for me has been a through line for the last few years. um, and I think is the through line throughout my entire journalism career, is that I started the Objective with some folks because I was upset, and um, I learned a lot from folks around me uh, in terms of how we're doing what we do now, which is media criticism and reporting about how journalism can be better, how journalism can be restorative and rather than harmful, how
Hmm.
journalism can be respectful of communities, how journalism can be coming from those communities rather than, from the windows or taking a view into those communities. And hopefully that's what I can talk about today. This topic really spoke to me. I think the Objective is very much focused on that, right? Like we do journalism that tries to critique systems of power, both inside the newsroom and outside the newsroom, and that often means, what is it meant for journalism in mainstream spaces to have excluded communities that they cover, and also what is it meant for them to have excluded communities that they cover inside the newsroom, right? So there was obviously the way that segregation was covered, for example, was happening outside the newsroom, but also newsrooms themselves were segregated for a long time. And so this topic spoke to me because I think a lot of the harms that we saw then have not really been repaired at all. And we've just sort of proceeded as a journalism field as if the harms of segregation in newsrooms have gone away. And in many ways, newsrooms still are segregated. In many ways,
Hmm.
certain types of jobs in newsrooms are used as a way to bring people in, and then as soon as layoffs happen, people of color are cut, right? And so this topic really spoke to me, both from the perspective of how newsrooms have covered folks, but also hired and retained, and in many cases laid off journalists of color.
When we're kind of talking about like the concept of reparative journalism, if you could just kind of give like a contrast and like how it differs between like traditional journalists. I know we touched on it a little bit, but let's say for the people who saw Kaleidoscope and was like, you know what, I enjoy colors and this is wonderful and I'm glad to be here. We just got to break it on down for them.
Yeah, I think what's really nice about today is that we have a lot of new frameworks for talking about what journalism can look like rather than just saying, journalism is objective. And journalism, obviously, I think should be fair, right? It should be respectful and it should be fact based. But there's so many frameworks for journalism today that we could talk about. We could talk about movement journalism, right? We could talk about solidarity journalism. And I think what's nice about that is for folks unfamiliar with, or not really sure what kind of journalism they should be practicing or how they want to move forward in their journalism, they can look to some of these frameworks and say,
Yeah.
this is how I want to practice my reporting, and not just, stick with the standard J school, journalism school framework or whatever they've seen in the New York Times. They can take a look and say, I want to do solidarity reporting, which tends to focus on, how is this impacting people on the ground? Like when I report this story out, I'm not going to focus on how the mayor feels about this. I'm going to focus on how people feel about this on the street where it happened. And I think looking to frameworks like that is going to give us a better future in journalism and a better understanding of what's actually happening, rather than just sticking to the same old harmful norms that have been reproduced over and over again.
So really, it's just like understanding like in the repair, it's like how are we framing these stories? Who are these stories for? What are these stories centered around? And is it telling the story, or is it telling an opinion, or is it telling the actual facts? And also too, going back to, it's like also understanding, well, if this happened, then we have to understand what happened before that so that we can get to what happened before that, so that we can get to really understanding what's happening now, so that way everybody has a well-rounded view of that.
Yeah, and I think that people often confuse telling stories about and telling stories for, and I think that's really important because I think a lot of the time journalists are not taught to think about their audience. Who is it that I'm reporting for? And it's just sort of this
Yeah.
nebulous cloud of, oh, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to get the truth. But for a lot of folks, a story in one community might look different in another, and particularly the way the story is told, if it's going to make people in power happy, is very different than the way it's going to be told from the perspective of those that are most impacted by policy, right? And I think it's
Yes.
really important to be able to parse that out and think, I'm reporting this story for the people that need it most, not for the mayor or the congressperson, right?
And so when I'm speaking about journalists, just that part, it's what role do you think journalists play in promoting healing and reconciliation through their reporting, versus the different hierarchies?
I think journalists should aspire to be storytellers and connectors, right? I think in many ways, journalists are not necessarily out there doing the work of the movement building, but I do think that they are out there supporting it by either uplifting what's happening and talking about what's happening in communities and showing folks that they can be seen in the media, right? Or
Yeah.
providing sort of services and connecting them with what's going on. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of great examples around the country. There's Outlier, there's El Timpano, and there's all of these newsrooms that are doing sort of connecting services by, I want to know what's happening in my city. I want to understand something. And so you can text those services and ask them questions, and it can be a dialogue rather than the sort of traditional journalism where you're just writing a story down. And so I think there's sort of those two buckets which are interconnected sometimes, are what I'm often thinking about, sort of connector and also storyteller.
Hmm. Speaking of connecting, it's how can people connect the dots between the promoting of the healing narratives and reconciliation to social justice in the field of journalism? Just piece it together for us.
I think one thing journalists can do and that I've seen done is not just look forward to the future, but also talk about the harms in the past, right? And I don't think we can move forward without talking about how journalism has been harmful in the past. And a lot of the
Yeah.
outlets that were harmful still exist. The New York Times exists, the LA Times exists. And sometimes some of these outlets have talked about, the New York Times, for example, has talked about how it was actually pretty offensive and pretty harmful during the AIDS crisis. The LA Times has talked about how they've failed to cover communities here in the past in Los Angeles. And I think you can't really move forward with that restoration and healing without actually talking to folks, many folks who are still alive, who were harmed by those narratives that, really inform everyone around them. And I think that's the way for us to sort of move forward, is by first acknowledging these things. And then after that, making sure that folks feel seen in the coverage, making sure that folks' work is being uplifted in the coverage. But I think first it starts with the acknowledgement.
The acknowledgement. No, absolutely. And so, in doing, or acknowledging these and having examples of some successful reparative journalism stories and the positive impact, are you able to just continue to connect those dots? When we saw this story and this is what happened because of it, and this is how, things changed. Are there any examples that you can give us of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one example that comes to mind for me is when I look at some of the work that's being done by sort of newer community focused outlets. I know I mentioned El
Mm-hmm.
Timpano earlier in the Bay Area. There's also Oakland Side. And I think what Oakland Side has done by starting off their newsroom with community listening, and it's a newer newsroom, but they kicked it off by holding listening sessions and asking folks before starting the reporting process, what do we want to do? What sort of reporting is useful to you? And I think a lot of the answers were, we don't just want crime reporting, we want arts reporting. We want to know what kind of community arts are happening in Oakland. And I think that kind of work is really critical. And I think newsrooms need to do a better job across the board of understanding what community wants before actually doing the reporting, because ultimately I think we're in service of community and not the other way around. And so I really like seeing these stories of newsrooms going out, asking people what's useful to you, what inspires you, what makes you happy, what's useful to you in the community. And a lot of the work the Objective does is covering sort of the meta of all of this, is taking a look
Mm-hmm.
at how are newsrooms changing, what are newsrooms doing better, what are they doing differently, what are they doing worse, but also what are they doing better, and how we can sort of move forward from, I think, a lot of the stagnation we've had over the last few decades with mainstream newsrooms.
Well, speaking of, newsrooms, and you say like what they're doing better. What are they doing better? Like, what are people doing now that this is here? It's not going anywhere. We're going to keep talking about it. What are newsrooms doing better to fill this along?
I think it's hard for me to look at old school legacy newsrooms and say they are doing significantly better. I think, as times change, the newsrooms do better with the times, and, hopefully the
Mm-hmm.
status quo makes them better. But I don't know that that's something I can applaud them for a lot of the time. I think a lot of the time they have to be pushed by communities to do better. And the sort of good work that I'm seeing for the most part is coming out of newer newsrooms, is coming out of um, legacy newsrooms, but not mainstream newsrooms, right? Like legacy black newsrooms. It's coming out of even in the legacy newsrooms, it's coming out of their unions, right? It's coming out of like worker led movements within the newsroom itself, and not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
from the newsroom's owner or the newsroom's bosses, right? It's coming out of the labor movements within the newsroom. So on the mainstream side, I feel like it's a lot of pushing. I think with a lot of the newer newsrooms, it's a lot of experimentation and figuring out what we can do better. And so I think that's what tends to inspire me, is looking at some of these newer newsrooms and seeing how are they talking to their communities, how are they making sure the
Mm-hmm.
coverage is useful, how are they making sure it's local, and how are they telling stories in a way that actually reflects the people that live there.
And so, speaking of like these, these newer newsrooms, and let's say you had, someone that's like, okay, I just got into business. I'm really trying to, have longevity, excuse me, in here. And so it's more or less like a mentorship type of question. It's like we know the like the overall, but it's like if we're going to get to the nitty gritty, what are some things that you can kind of give these newer newsrooms? Like, okay, this is from my experience. This is where you got to go to navigate, so that way you can stay strong and maintain and continue on.
Yeah, I think the thing that has to drive you is community, right? Like, I think this work is really expensive. It's really hard. It's really exhausting. And I think it's not possible to do this unless it feels restorative for you, unless you build
Mm-hmm.
community feedback and even personal rest into the work for yourself, because it's hard. It's hard to fundraise for this work. It's hard to ask community members who have been harmed by journalism in the past for money, right? For subscriptions. And so I think a lot of it is making sure that the work feels restorative to you, and as
Yeah.
much as you can. Um, but yeah, I think the business model for journalism has really taken a turn for the worst. So I think it's really a thing where if you're doing this and if you're starting out, it has to feel right to you. You have to feel like you have the backing of your community, because otherwise that disconnect is just not going to work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like it's hard out here. Like, yes, it is hard. It is hard out here. Dot dot dot. And so I know sometimes too, like just thinking about how hard things can be, and some of the things that we have to face to stay, and pursue our dreams, and continue on with the work. But I want to kind of shift and talk about ethics in journalism, ethics, and being ethical and respectful. And so it's like, how can, journalists, new journalists and, seasoned journalists ensure that their reporting is ethical and respectful when covering these sensitive topics related to social justice and healing narratives, and also too, like, fighting against the, I gotta do it. I gotta put it out there. I gotta make it.
I think it's really hard when you're a newer journalist. I think when you have the pressure of an editor or a newsroom in front of you telling you you need to churn out stories, you need to get stories out, it can be really difficult. And I think if you're starting out in the field, it's often worth thinking about, what is the red line for me personally? Like, what is the ethical boundary that I won't cross in order to get out a story? And I think that's really hard. It can put you as a journalist in a really precarious situation to say, I'm not going to publish this. You might get, punished at work, you might get written up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's worth thinking about, what is it that I'm not going to do, especially if you work in a newsroom where you don't always agree with all the decisions being made. And also, I think it's worth thinking about what newsrooms do I want to work in that aren't going to push me over that line and are, in fact, going to sort of push the boundaries of what I actually want to see in journalism, because I think a lot of the discussion that's happening, even over the last 5 years, has been focused on this idea of objectivity. And I think
Mm-hmm.
the discussion that's happening is not really fruitful. The origins of objectivity in journalism were a sort of practice, a set of tools in order to do fact based reporting. And a lot of the way it's been distorted over the years has been, people saying, I'm personally objective. I don't bring any biases to journalism. And that's not
Right.
true. That's not how journalism works.
No.
That's not how people work. Um, and I think there's been great, back and forth in the New York Times. Wesley Lowery wrote a piece a few years ago about objectivity in journalism and said we need to have moral clarity in our journalism. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think we're getting lost in this back and forth discussion. And I think what Wesley was advocating for is where we need to go. And it's frustrating to
Mm-hmm.
me to see any pushback from that. Because, objectivity, like I said, it's just a set of tools. You can describe it differently. You can say, actually, instead of objectivity, we just want to say we want to do fact-based ethical reporting. We want to be fair to people. So that's often what I'm thinking about, is this idea that we're getting lost on this discussion of objectivity
Yeah.
instead of talking about, well, what do we actually want to do? What are the ethical guidelines that we want to have in journalism? How do we want to make sure we're not showing up and causing harm in communities? And there are a lot of folks thinking about that, but it's frustrating to
Mm-hmm.
see this caught up conversation on objectivity rather than talking about what I mentioned earlier, solidarity journalism or movement journalism, or what should we not be doing in communities? How can we make sure that the journalists we're hiring are from the communities that we're covering rather
Yes.
than parachuting people in? I think there's a lot of interesting discussions to be had. And I think a lot of newsrooms are kind of figuring out on their own a lot of the time because we're caught up in this sort of stagnant
Yeah.
conversation about objectivity.
Yeah. And really, like, like you were saying, there's different, aspects, but really there's no manual that says, here you go. This is it. These are the lines that I can't cross. These is what I should or shouldn't do. And like, you really have to take that on for yourself to be able to know, like, okay, this is personal. This is for me. And even going back to some of the things that you were saying, is like how to help, new or up and coming journalists, or even, seasoned journalists, like, take care of themselves. Like when we talk about, like, reparative journalism, it's like, how are we being reparative journalists? What am I doing to keep myself, you know what I mean, like, in well-being? What am I doing to make sure that, in my own life, this is how I'm living? So if you just want to touch on some of the things that, that you do, or some of the ways that you stay cognizant of this.
Yeah, I think what I was talking about earlier with rest is really important. I think it's really easy to be frustrated. It's really easy to be angry. And when you're angry and frustrated about the way journalism is being done around the country and even locally, it's hard to take a breather and say, I need to not pick up my phone right when I wake up and take a look and be angry. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to put down the phone at night and say, I had my time during the day to focus on this. I'm going to take a break and sort of repair myself and make sure that I'm doing okay so that I can continue the next day and sort of keep focusing on this. And so a lot of what I am telling folks and a lot of what I'm trying to do and practice for myself is that separation, because I've seen journalists burn out, and I've seen a lot of journalists of color burn out just from being so exhausted and angry all the time about the state of things.
Mm-hmm. And so, first of all, thank you for that, because then you're like, my personal rest and relaxation practices. But it's sometimes it's good, like, as we're talking about, everyone else, it's like we have to, it starts here and then we get to move out, to everyone else. And so as we're coming down to a close, I just want to ask, like, when you see the future of reparative journalism, evolving, like, in a perfect world, what challenges can we anticipate in its implementation, and where do you see it going, and where do you want to see it go?
I think where I see it going right now is honestly not a great place. I'm really inspired by a lot of the work that's being done and a lot of the experimentation. But where I see it going right now, with journalism shrinking and declining and folks sort of fighting over resources, is a place where more and more folks, especially in bigger cities, don't have access to quality information. They don't have access to
Mhm.
storytelling that represents them. And I think what I would like to see is a refocusing on how can we support newer newsrooms and older newsrooms that have been there that are doing this work. And I think what a positive future looks to me is well-resourced newsrooms from their community telling stories about their community and connecting their community to the resources that government is failing them to connect them to. How whatever public health information they need, whatever transportation information they need, whatever housing information, that's what the future of journalism should look like. And I think that's not just going to take one newsroom in a community. It's going to take a lot of newsrooms in a community and a lot of different experimentation. And so I hope that's what the future looks like. And I think that's what I try to work towards. But I definitely am really scared right now about the future of journalism. I won't lie.
You said you're very scared for the future of journalism and
Overall, just I won't lie that I'm not. Yeah, I try to be hopeful and positive, but I'm definitely frightened.
because you just is it just like a it's on the decline or it's like
It feels on the decline, and I've watched so many folks burn out because of the resource scarcity that I'm always wondering, maybe this has to look different. Maybe we need to figure out another
yeah
way to do this. Or maybe this isn't sustainable in this way, but it feels like something where cities, counties, governments, individual people, philanthropy all need to come together to figure out what is the system that can make this work. Because I don't really think that the world can continue to function or grow and progress without good journalism, right? Without people connecting each other, without
absolutely
storytelling.
absolutely and like I said, and we need it. It is a must. We have to have it because unfortunately if we let the powers that be shape and control the narrative, it's like what are we going to do? How are we going to receive the information that we need to inform us, to shape our beliefs, to shape our actions? We need to keep that. We need to hold that sacred because without that, literally it's just one false belief after another, one narrative, and it's like next thing you know we're all sheep. I mean, I can go on about being we're all sheep, but so I want to talk about just like what can people do to support the objective and support other newsrooms like that, but support other newsrooms like that, but what can we do to get involved? How can we continue to come together and make some things happen for us?
Yeah, I think for the objective, what I encourage folks to do is submit media criticism reporting to us. I think one of the ways that we move forward is by talking about what's happening in journalism and talking about the harms and talking about the ways we move forward. And I would encourage folks, not just from journalism, but overall, if you are working in a particular movement, just to think about how you would want to talk about journalism and then write to us, right? Pitch us, because I think there's a lot of ways that journalism can change. And I think it starts by talking about, I've been harmed in this way, this movement has been harmed in this way, or I've seen something great. I really want to talk about how journalism can be like this. I think outside of that, from a resource standpoint, I would say donate. I would say support our work in whatever way you can, because I think without this sort of accountability practice in journalism, without talking
Yeah,
about how journalism is being done, I think we end up in a place where journalism doesn't shift. You end up with just a sort of PR for good journalism, and we're not really talking about the accountability angle of, well, why did it happen like this? And
right.
we can't just move on from that.
No, absolutely. And so to make sure that we keep this conversation going, to make sure that folks stay involved, Gabe, where can we find you? Where can we donate? What social media? Give us the thing so that way we can continue on.
You can read us on our website. You can subscribe to our email newsletter at The Objective. You can donate there. Everything should be right on the website. So feel free to just check us out online.
Okay. And then what about you? Where can we find you?
I'm on Twitter for now. Outside of that, I'm also writing on The Objective when I have time. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I don't know why LinkedIn seems to be the only social media that's functioning lately, but I'm on Twitter.
Okay. Twitter and LinkedIn. and going to the Objective. What was that website?
It's if you just Google the Objective, it'll pop up. It should just be objectivejournalism.org.
Okay, perfect. All right, Gabe. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your gems. It was such a pleasure being with you today. And also, too, I really know that at the end of the day, we're going to continue on. We're going to, continue to support. And so we'll definitely be talking soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you.